What happens when you are everything people tell you not to be all at once? Too loud, too direct, too emotional, too smart, too much, too angry. Fern Brady has been called all of those things and then some. Fern is a Scottish comedian, writer, and author. She is autistic, and for a long time, she didn't know it. I first came across Fern through Taskmaster UK and then subsequently saw her in interviews and looked for some of her comedy and absolutely loved it. So when she released her book, Strong Female Character, it was an absolute no brainer for me. It went straight on my Christmas list. And let me tell you, I could not put it down. It was laugh out loud funny. It was my subway book. So I'd be sitting on the subway reading and laughing to myself as I discovered Fern's story. And, at times it was really relatable, and at others, just absolutely, completely wild. But underneath all of it, there was a very clear thread running through her story, and that was that she was always too much, right? She was too different, too direct, too smart, too behavioral, too loud. She didn't act like a girl was supposed to act. She was too antisocial. She got into too much trouble. You get the picture, right? And all of the too muches that you can probably think of. And the thing about Fern's story is that it doesn't present itself neatly like other people's might. It isn't a clean narrative, and it's not a polished version of growth. It's messy, it's chaotic, and it's very real. She writes about her life in a way that doesn't try to soften it. Her experiences in relationships, and the abuse she experiences, her struggles with her own identity, her time working as a stripper. And one of the things I really loved about that in particular is how she describes it, because from the outside, people create all these assumptions of how, glamorous being a stripper is, or the club, and how kind of like much must go on there. But from her perspective, it was often just work. It was part of her routine. It was repetitive and oftentimes really boring. And I remember thinking to myself that there's something genuinely funny about that. The idea of a sitcom told from the stripper's reality and not the fantasy version that people project onto it, but the actual day to day experience and the monotony. And honestly, the TV producers that turned that down, absolute idiots. Because what she captures in her writing is this really unique perspective. And it's the gap between how something is perceived and how it's actually lived and experienced. Not to mention that she actually highlights how many people within the stripping industry actually identify with autistic traits or being autistic. Fascinating read. I guarantee the book. I recommend reading the book. Um, but that's kind of where the gap shows up everywhere in her story, right? Because for a long time, Fern didn't know she was autistic, even though she started to suspect at some point, right? Everything she experienced then had no clear explanation. And there was just a consistent sense of not fitting in, not understanding, and not being understood. And when you don't have the language for that, it can really turn into something else entirely, right? Confusion, frustration, and anger, because you're trying to figure out who you are without a framework that actually makes sense to you. And that's something I really recognized in her story when she was talking about the religious views of her family, of the local community, her school, etc. And that feeling of trying to understand yourself, but not quite being able to, of reacting really strongly towards certain things and just not knowing why. Um, and that's something a lot of us do experience, especially those of us that might be autistic or ADHD or one of the different types of neurodivergent. And you're kind of reacting to constantly being told that you're too much or that you're not acting in the right way, but without anybody stopping to ask what's actually going on underneath that. And I mean, Fern also talks about how her parents did try to get her help, and her experience in different psychiatric facilities and how they weren't helpful to her, but the mischief she got up into in there. Um, but I think one of the things that I really took away from her story is that in spite of all of this, in spite of it taking so long for somebody to see her as she was, she kept going anyway. And she kept going through unstable periods, through really difficult environments, through relationships that didn't not only misunderstand or support her, but at times became very dangerous. She didn't have clarity, but she had momentum. And eventually she earned her degree. And that matters because it wasn't a straight line. It wasn't structured, and it wasn't supported in the way that it should have been. But she did it anyway. And later on, she was diagnosed as autistic. And then suddenly there was context for her entire life. Not an excuse, not a limitation, just context. A way of understanding the patterns that had always been there and she knew were there, but couldn't put her finger on. Her directness, her intensity, her reactions, her way of thinking, even her angry outbursts. So the things that had been labeled as too much or difficult or behavioral could now actually be seen differently, not just by her, but by those around her. And that doesn't erase the past, but it does change how you hold on to it. And Fern spoke at length about masking and trying to navigate environments that didn't fit, including in her comedy career. And she talks about the cost of constantly having to adjust. And then what happens when you start to understand yourself. So she's now in a relationship where she has space to be herself. And that's really significant because when you've spent your entire life being misunderstood, being in an environment where you don't then constantly have to adjust isn't small, it's everything. And this is where her story connects to something bigger, for me at least. And maybe for many other neurodivergent women, especially those of us that were diagnosed later in life. The story isn't, I always knew who I was. It's, I knew something didn't fit. I knew I didn't fit, but I just didn't know why. And when you don't know why, you really start to internalize that. You think it's you, and you start to think, I'm too much, I'm too difficult, and I'm the problem. And Fern Brady's story really challenges that, not by presenting this perfect vision of growth, but by showing the reality of it messy, unclear, at times insanely chaotic, but still moving forward, still building something and still becoming. And when you look at her story now, she wasn't too much. She wasn't too loud, and she certainly wasn't too difficult. She was navigating a world that didn't have the language for who she was yet. And she didn't change, the narrative did. And like many of us, hearing these stories that we can connect to and being able to see ourselves reflected in other women, men like us, in within our communities, if we're seeing that representation, then it really gives us something to kind of build on and recognize. And that is that so many of us have been failed by so many of these different systems, and we were never the problem. It's the systems that need to change. Okay, if you want to learn more, you can check out our website. The link will be in the comments. And we look forward to seeing you next time on our snack chats. Okay, thanks for joining us. Bye.